Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at CAP, which is a really cool yield-bearing stablecoin protocol that's completely rewiring how yield gets generated. So we'll be looking at what CAP is, how it works, and how you as a user could get really good yield without taking on any risk. Sounds crazy, right? Let's get right into it. So before we get into what CAP is, maybe it would help to take a step back and understand where we are in terms of the yield-bearing stablecoins today. So many of the yield-bearing stablecoin protocols today are pretty much hedge funds. And the reason I say this is because of the way that they operate. So a typical interaction with many of the yield-bearing stablecoin protocols today would be something like this. You as a user would deposit USDC or USDT into this protocol. Let's call this protocol X. And in return, you'd receive this protocol's stablecoin, which is xUSD. So imagine you deposit 100 USDC, you would receive 100 xUSD. So this is a plain vanilla stablecoin. You would then go on to stake this to receive staked xUSD. So this is the yield-bearing stablecoin, right? This gives you the yield component, right? So where is this yield exactly coming from? So the team behind X protocol would take this capital that you deposited, let's call this the reserves, and run different strategies. Strategy A, strategy B. Make returns, make yield from these strategies. And this yield comes back to stakers of xUSD. So this is a very high level flow of how many of the yield-bearing stablecoin protocols today work. So there are two main issues with this kind of a setup. First issue, you probably already guessed, is that there is this centralization risk here, right? So the team behind X protocol pretty much calls the shots in this entire system, right? They get to decide how much of the reserves are put into different strategies and what kind of strategies get run, right? So that's a big centralization risk. Second issue is that there is a cap of how many strategies that this team can run. So maybe this is a 5 to 10 person team that is capable of doing 3 to 4 strategies at the max, right? They can run these 3 to 4 strategies really well. So let's suppose those 3 to 4 strategies work really well in bull markets. But what happens when those strategies don't work well in bear markets? So you kind of see that there is a cap of how many strategies this small team can run, right? So those are the two main issues with this current setup. So CAP takes a look at this and says, okay, how can we scale the number of people that are running these strategies, and how can we scale the number of strategies that are getting run? So it looks at this and improves on this existing flow and introduces a 3-sided marketplace. So the first side of this marketplace is the users. So users would deposit USDC or USDT into CAP and in return receive an equal amount of cUSD, which is CAP's stablecoin, right? The user would then go ahead and stake the cUSD to receive staked cUSD, which is the yield-bearing stablecoin. This gives you the yield component, right? So I know what you're thinking. This is very similar to the previous example, and you're absolutely right. So what changes in CAP? So let's suppose that there is $100 million in reserves here. That also means that there is 100 million cUSD, because cUSD as a stablecoin is backed 1:1 with the reserves, right? So instead of CAP being the only one and the sole entity that runs different strategies and allocates this 100 million, like the previous example that we saw, CAP introduces something called the operators. So who are these operators? Operators can be market makers, HFT firms, private credit firms, and a bunch of other sophisticated players in the market. So these guys have really good edge in the market, right? They are trading day in, day out. They make a lot of money. And so the idea behind CAP is that you would bring into the system a bunch of sophisticated firms and allow them to take some of these reserves and run their different strategies, and those strategies would make money, and that yield would come back to stakers of cUSD. So this is the general idea, right? And I know what you're thinking. What happens when one of these operators kind of takes some amount from these reserves and kind of loses it, right? Great question. And that's where the third and final piece of CAP comes in, which is the restakers. So who are restakers? Restakers, as we know them, are people who have staked ETH and they want to delegate their staked ETH to other networks to secure them and earn yield on top of their staked ETH, right? So their primary objective is to earn more yield on their staked ETH. So let's suppose there is 3 different restakers in CAP. In reality, there are a bunch of restakers in CAP across EigenLayer and Symbiotic. And for operators or the market maker here to take some money from this 100 million, to take some money from the reserves, they have to get into an agreement with the restakers in such a way that restakers would put down their staked ETH and delegate it in CAP to underwrite the risk of these market makers or HFT firms or private credit firms, right? So I know it's a bunch of jargon and it might sound confusing. The way I like to think about it is that operators, like the market maker, is like a 21-year-old dude, and he wants to run different strategies. He wants to start a business basically, and he goes to the bank, which in this case is the reserves, right? And wants to borrow some money, and the bank is going to say, okay, we're not going to loan you any money, right? And so he has this very wealthy billionaire uncle that he goes to and kind of tells him whatever happened and gives him the business plan and the strategies and stuff like that. So the uncle is going to look through the strategies and he's going to get really convinced that this strategies or this business is going to be a really good success, right? And it's going to make a lot of money. So the uncle is going to say, okay, I'm going to put up $20 million of my own money so that this would act as a guarantee or an insurance, and so you can go to the bank and borrow some money, right? And he's also going to say, okay, I'm putting up $20 million. $20 million is a lot of money for me. I could put it somewhere else and earn yield on it. I'm going to put it up for you, right? So you are going to give me 3 to 4% annually for me taking on your risk, right? So this is a typical kind of interaction of what happens between operators and restakers. So in this case, this market maker gets into a relationship with this restaker X, and this restaker X puts up $20 million worth of staked ETH. And with this delegated in CAP, this market maker goes and borrows maybe $10 million, right? So with this $10 million, he runs those strategies, and there could be 2 outcomes, right? The first outcome would be that he would make a lot of money, and the second outcome is he loses the money, right? So let's look at both the scenarios and see how it works, right? So first scenario where he would take that $10 million and make $2 million, right? So that's 20%. So he makes 20% plus 20%. So what happens with this 20%? So CAP is something called the hurdle rate so this is a percentage that these operators need to give back to this ecosystem, right? Need to give back to stakers of cUSD. So it could be 8%, 9%, 10%, depending on market conditions, right? So let's suppose that the hurdle rate is 8% right now. So out of this 20%, 8% would go to the stakers of cUSD. Second, you remember we talked about the uncle asking the 21-year-old dude to give him a 3 to 4% risk premium. So that risk premium, the market maker has to pay back to the restakers, which could be like 4%. So the remaining 8% is the delta. So it's all his to keep. So this market maker can keep the entire 8%, right? So this is the ideal scenario where the market maker ends up making money. So what happens when instead of making $2 million, he loses $2 million, right? Minus 2 million. So there is a big issue when this market maker is losing $2 million because this reserves was $100 million, and with this $2 million lost, that's only $98 million in reserves, backing 100 million cUSD. So there is a hole here. And obviously cUSD would depeg, right? So what happens here? CAP introduces something called slashing, right? So what happens during slashing? Liquidators go and liquidate this $20 million in delegated staked ETH and sell off $2 million worth of staked ETH. And that $2 million goes back into filling this hole. So this hole doesn't exist anymore. You have 100 million cUSD and you have $100 million backing it, right? So this is the worst case scenario where the operator loses money. So I know what you're thinking. Why are restakers kind of taking the hit? Why do you have to liquidate $2 million from this $20 million, right? So we discussed that restakers are the ones that are convinced that this strategy will work, right? And they even got paid a 3 to 4% premium on top, the risk premium, right? So anything that happens, it's the restakers that are going to take the hit. They're the ones that are getting penalized in this case, right? So as a user, even if these operators kind of lose money, it really doesn't affect you and you're not taking on any risk. So the reason why I like CAP so much is because of the way that it's a win-win-win scenario across all three sides of this marketplace, right? Users love CAP, operators love CAP, and restakers also love CAP. So why do users love CAP? Users love CAP because they're getting really good yield from people who they would never have imagined they would have access to yield from, right? These guys are very sophisticated, right? So they love that. And I think I also didn't mention is that suppose there's only 20 million that is lent out to these operators, the remaining 80 million is sitting in Aave and Morpho and DeFi protocols like that, all right? So it's earning base yield, and on top of that, you're earning yield from strategies, different strategies, multiple strategies of these operators, right? So that's stackable yield that you get. And worst case scenario, you don't lose any money here. Restakers are the one taking the losses, right? So users love CAP. Why do operators love CAP? Operators love CAP because of the way that they can just add $10 million into their books without it costing them anything. And whatever they make on top of it, they get to keep everything, right? So that's why operators love CAP. Why do restakers love CAP? Restakers love CAP because they get to earn more yield on their staked ETH, right? They want to put their staked ETH in different networks. And in this case, they can get 3 to 4% on top of their 2%, which is like 6-7% on their staked ETH, right? So that's why real stakers love CAP. So this is a very high level overview of how CAP works. And there are a bunch of more technicalities and nuances with this approach that you can definitely check out in the docs. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.